Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, for those of you in the Eastern United States, and hello to everyone else. My name is Bill Wolf, and we are going to be talking today on PowerShell and the art of SQL Server deployment from Mr. Mike Fowl. Before doing this, however, I wanted to make sure to remind you guys that the new year is swinging up. So I know in the U.S., the first SQL Saturday this year is in SQL Saturday Nashville. If you guys would like to, if anybody's in the area, you can sign up to go to Nashville. If not, there are plenty of virtual user groups that you can gain lots of information from. Of course, our favorite is the DevOps user group. And if anything, go to pass.org, and there are many ways you can learn. I do also know the recordings for Pass Summit have just come out recently. So if you attended Pass Summit, you can obtain a copy of those recordings. It's most beneficial. You can listen to them while you work. And there we go. So I'm going to hand this over right to Mike. Again, Mike Fowl is a data platform MVP. He works for Rubrik, and a good friend of mine is also very much a PowerShell and SQL expert. So I'm going to hand this over to him, and he can begin.
All right. Well, thanks, Bill. Appreciate it, and appreciate everybody logging in to hear me blather about two of my favorite topics, PowerShell and SQL Server. Just real quick, Bill gave you a quick intro about me. Again, my name's Mike Fowl. Work for a company called Rubrik. We are a data protection platform, and I'm there as kind of their SQL Server subject matter expert. So if you have questions about backup and recovery and how you might be protecting your databases better, hit me up. Happy to show you what we do. In addition to that, big on PowerShell, big on SQL, Microsoft Data Platform, MVP, blog. I blog up at mikefall.net. So if you guys, now I admit it's been about 9 months since I've blogged and I need to get back to it, but I've got lots of blog posts on using PowerShell and SQL Server together. A lot of the foundations for this presentation you can find in my blog posts. With that, let's dive right into it, right? What's our agenda for today? And basically it's going to be the why and how of automation. I am an automation freak. What I also will say is I'm a lazy DBA. I'm very much one of these people that if I can script something, I will. And really that's what this is all about. And what this then we'll move into talking about, okay, so what kind of tools are available to us around SQL Server and automation, particularly from the PowerShell viewpoint, and what can we use in there. We'll talk about what our build plan is going to be, and then ultimately at the end of it, I'm just going to show you how my scripts work. And I'm going to be using some scripts that I have out on GitHub I use to rebuild my own local virtual lab. Basically with this scripts, I can reinstantiate my full VM lab, which is just a domain controller and a couple SQL servers, but do it in 30, 45 minutes. And I'm always looking for ways to improve that and to speed that up. In fact, as prepping for this presentation over the last week, I've probably rebuilt my lab maybe 15, 20 times, just testing things out and making sure it's going to work. The other thing I always like to touch on here is please, please, please don't panic. I'm a big fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and that phrase just resonates with me. I'm going to throw a lot of code with you. In fact, I was just telling Bill before we got started here, this presentation is probably my most technically involved presentation. There's a lot of scripts. There's a lot of code. Do not feel like you have to absorb it all today. Focus on what I'm doing. Focus on the concepts. Focus on kind of the purpose of the code. Don't worry so much about, oh, what's that exact syntax that he's doing. This is all available on GitHub. You can download it. You can review it at your leisure. In fact, I encouraged you to go up and get the code and pick it apart. I mean, chances are you might find a better way of doing things than I did. The other thing is feel free to ask questions. We have the question interface here with the WebEx. I'll probably take pauses within the presentation to ask Bill, and Bill, if you could just manage the questions for me, I'd appreciate that. But we'll try and respond to those questions as we go. If there's something that's not clear, I want to try and make sure that it's clear to you. and with that, we'll just jump in. The why and how do we go about automation? Why is automation such a big deal, particularly in today's world and in our enterprise setups, right? And it's really about consistency and reliability. With the size that enterprises are growing now, right? We've gone from having maybe 5 to 10 SQL servers to having 50 to having 100 to having maybe thousands of SQL servers, thousands of databases. You know, these environments become very unwieldy to manage when we start thinking about, oh, the ways that we used to do it. And so really this is where automation comes into play. And it's not even just with SQL Server, right? It's beyond those platforms to other environments. But you know, really what we want to focus on is we want tools that allow us to deploy things the same way every time, right? We want to make sure that the processes we're going through are repeatable, are consistent, are always managed in the same way so that we don't get any sort of variance. In fact, most of the time when I have had issues in an environment, when I've been managing stuff, most of the time the reason that we had a problem is something was different than everything else. You know, maybe we had a different MaxDOF setting. Maybe we had a different drive configuration. You know, maybe we were missing a user that we were supposed to have. And that's really what we're trying to do with the automation. In fact, that quote that I put down there is basically me just bloviating on the fact that it's like, look, you know, most of the time when I have run into an issue, it's because something wasn't done, we missed something, or something wasn't done with consistent with our best practices. So then how do we go about doing it, right? And you know, what are the steps to kind of get to an automated solution? And for me, it's always starting with the process. You might have heard of this before as like run books or checklists, right? Things that you might have done in years gone by where you're like, okay, I'm going to document out all the steps that I need to do to stand up a SQL server. And that's really where it starts. I'll often tell people that in my mind, a checklist is the first form of automation, right? If we think about, like, we've got our database normal forms, right? You go through the process of normalizing out the data. Well, when you go through the process of automating, you got to start somewhere. And to me, starting somewhere is documenting and understanding what your process is. And until you know that, I should say, until you know what your process is, it's impossible to automate it. You're not going to just start bang scripts out and go, okay, hey, what's gonna do? What's this gonna happen? Process. You should always sit down and say, what are the steps that I need to enact? And then you start to build your scripts and your tool, your automation out of that. And that's when the tool comes into play, right? Once you have a documented process, the next step is to say, okay, now I actually want to put some scripts around it. And for me, it's PowerShell or it's T-SQL. Maybe for some folks, it's a batch file, right? Maybe other people are going to be using Chef or Puppet. Maybe some people are going to be using some other tool that's out there. It doesn't so much matter which tool you use. Again, this presentation is focusing on PowerShell and T-SQL. But ultimately, you're going to need something to take that process and then build an automation around it. And then that's where it leads into having a script, right? This is where we're going to start to actually build out the actions, the scripts, whatever's going to run that automation for us. Once we have the tool that we know and the process we're going to automate, it's next into building that out. And that's pretty much the how and why. Really, this is the whole reason why we're here and then how we get to it. I'm going to take a brief pause before talking about the tooling. Any questions so far out there from the folks, Wolf?
Not at this moment. Okay,
excellent, cool. Excuse me. So just moving right along, let's talk about the tooling. And you know, you all came here because you saw the title PowerShell in the subject, right? You always said, oh, PowerShell, I gotta get in on that. And a lot of times when I talk to DBAs, they'll ask me, okay, what's the big deal about PowerShell? Why do I need to learn PowerShell? In fact, I've had many DBAs go, I already know T-SQL. I don't really need to know PowerShell, right? And you know, I always like to challenge that because to me, PowerShell it's more than just, okay, I'm going to start using a different scripting language. In fact, in many ways, it's complementary to T-SQL. And the big reason for me, at least starting off, is PowerShell is a framework. PowerShell wraps around many different parts of the Windows stack. It's not just for SQL Server. It's not just for the file system. It allows me to interact with these different pieces and parts of the Windows stack that I can then start to bring things together for a full workflow or full process. I mean, if you think about it, like for example, when I'm installing SQL Server, one of the things I need to do, and we'll see this in the demo, is I need to run SQL under a service account. Well, maybe part of my automation or part of my process is I want to set up a new service account for that. Well, that's not something I'm going to do with SQL Server, so I'll go do that in Windows. And I can have a PowerShell script that says, create a new service account for this SQL Server I'm going to build, and then set it up, get all the configurations into it. And now, because I know of that, it's been built on the fly for this particular SQL Server. Then when I go and do the SQL install, I'm going to have access to that. And you can start to build these pieces out where you're touching different components of the stack and not have to worry about, how am I going to call, the Active Directory for SQL Server, or how am I going to, like that's the one thing I'll tell people, like I know I can do file system operations in SQL Server, but they suck. So I would prefer to use PowerShell to do that and let SQL do SQL. Now the other thing I always like to call out here is PowerShell is built from the ground up to be multi-server. It's not just a one-for-one operation. And so this allows us to build scripts and automation tools right off the bat that aren't just going to do like one-offs for us. In fact, when we go through the demo, you're going to see that I'm actually going to be spinning up 2 SQL servers at one time. And it's all the same script, right? It's all minimized effort from the script just to say, okay, now I'm just going to run the same thing across multiple servers instead of just one at a time. I like PowerShell also because it's built off of .NET. This is a key element of PowerShell, and very important for the Windows stack. Or if you saw the news yesterday, PowerShell came out. PowerShell 6 Core came out, so they've built a version of .NET that can deploy to Linux and to Windows to be cross-platform. And now PowerShell can run on that and use those .NET libraries. The other important thing about using .NET is it makes it object-aware. I tell people often that PowerShell is an object-aware language, not an object-oriented language. And so what this means is we can now deal with objects within our scripts that have rich information. It's not just a matter of, oh, I've got a script variable that stores a string. It's now, okay, I've got an object that has an instance and an IP address and all these different values. And as data people, I know certainly as a data person myself, I always get jazzed up about, oh, now I have these rich objects to work with that give me more information about the processes. And then finally, I like the fact that it's a script that I can hand it to somebody else and say, here, run this and call me if there's an error. It's that lazy DBA coming into play. Now, when we start talking about PowerShell, they've added something with PowerShell 4.0, so it's been out for a couple years, called Desired State Configuration, or DSC. Now, if you're familiar with Chef or Puppet, you've probably seen something similar to this. This is PowerShell's implementation of it. But it's one of these things that allows us to actually make declarative configurations of what should be installed to a server. Setting up things like Windows features or file paths or even applications. But we can declare this in a particular syntax that allows us to use what are called resources and actually start to set up our servers without having to go through these complicated scripts of, okay, I'm going to add this feature and add that feature. It's a little more intuitive. And kind of the way that it works, right, is we'll set these configurations and we'll use resources in these configurations and create what's called a .mof file or a MOF file. And this MOF file can then go out and run on any number of servers. And actually, once that engine runs using that MOF file, it will set up the server in a consistent way. And when we get into the demo, you're going to see more of kind of, okay, what does DSC look like and how does it actually operate? But this is a tool that I've become a fan of certain parts of it. I'm going to be upfront with you guys. There's some aspects of DSC that aren't as mature as I would like them to be. We'll talk about, in fact, talking about SQL Server, there's a SQL Server resource for DSC. I personally don't like it. It's been developed and it does some cool things, but in some ways it's just a wrapper for the setup.executable, setup.exe. And I find that actually using an INI file has worked better for me for deploying SQL Server because it's consistent, it's known, it's been out there for a while, it's pretty rock solid, and it doesn't add some of the overhead that we would run into from other processes. So that's the second tool that I use for this. Is I'm going to use the DSC to kind of get servers configured, and then I'm going to use this INI to actually do my SQL install to set stuff up. Now, in addition to this, right, we have within PowerShell, we have the SQL Server PowerShell module. This actually wraps up our SMO libraries as well as plenty of functionality to execute SQL Server actions. When I actually get into the demo, you're going to see that in certain places I need to run a SQL query. I mean, just because I'm using PowerShell doesn't mean I'm suddenly throwing T-SQL out of the window. I'm not going to just get rid of it. Say, oh, hey, I'm not using this anymore. I'm going to actually use this PowerShell module to call T-SQL or to send T-SQL to my instances to do some of the configuration steps. Because frankly, at the end of the day, it's going to be SQL anyway, even if I use some other abstraction layer. So I might as well just use the native SQL and what I'm familiar with. So these are the tools that I'm going to use to actually do the SQL Server deployment and walk through the process. And again, most of this is going to be making sense once I actually get into the demo. I'm going to take a brief pause here before I talk about what our build plan is going to be and just say, hey, Wolf, are there any questions out there, anything that people have brought up?
None thus far.
Oh, wow. So this is the thing, I always get a little nervous when there aren't any questions because either I'm doing a great job of explaining things or everybody's lost. So I'm going to assume I'm doing a great job because, well, I try to, and then we'll just keep moving on.
I have gotten a question unrelated. Somebody said it's just somebody said, will this be recorded? And yes, Maurice is being recorded.
Yes, so this will be saved for all eternity, for your posterity, for your children. So not only you can get them up on PowerShell and SQL Server, but anybody else, you can just distribute it out, share it with your friends, your family. All right, so let's talk. We've talked about the tools, but going back to the beginning of the presentation, right? I talked about having a process, having a checklist. And so this is the demo. When I go through the demo, this is what we're going to try and end up doing. So I'm going to build 2 SQL Server 2016 instances, SP1, installed onto 2 Server 2016 core machines. Now, I'm doing a little bit of cheating because I don't want to sit and wait for these scripts to run. So I've actually got the 2 server, and oh, wow, that's a typo. There is no server 2106. It's 2016. My bad. So anyway, I've already set up the servers. I've got them joined to my domain, but there's no SQL installed on them yet. So we'll walk you through that install process. But then once I do that, we're going to configure SQL Server, get some base configurations going on. Then we're going to create an availability group, and then finally deploy AdventureWorks 2014 to that availability group. And this is all going to be script driven, right? I'm going to basically run a script and then hands off. Now, if we talk about the OS, I've already done, again, a lot of this, but we've created a Server 2016 core base instance, and I've got 2 of these. I've installed the failover clusters feature because we need that to support availability groups. I've also created 2 firewall ports. So just so you guys are aware, I'm leaving the Windows firewall running here. So this does mean I have to open up port 1433 for SQL. And because we're building an availability group, I need to open port 5022. And that's just the default. I mean, I could use other ports if I wanted to, but I'm sticking with the defaults for simplicity's sake. Also, I'm going to create some default directories. So I've got DB files data, DB files log, and DB files tempdb for my SQL deployment. If I were doing this with a live, in production, I'd probably be setting this up on some other volume other than the OS. But since this is a demonstration and we're using lab machines, it's all going to be on that C drive. Now, once I've got the OS, I'm going to go ahead and set up SQL Server. And SQL Server is going to be using 2016 SP1, the developer edition. And I'm just going to be doing the SQL engine features. I'm not going to be doing like a whole lot of crazy stuff like SSIS, SSAS. But I think as you see the process, it's going to make sense to you, okay, this is where I would add those other features if I wanted to do this in my own environment. Now, of course, by default, TCP is going to be disabled with SQL Server, and I always have to enable that. And that's always one of those things, honestly, I forget. When I'm just like doing SQL from the GUI, I almost always forget to enable TCP communication. This is one of the reasons why I script this out, is so that I will remember, or that I let the script remember for me, right? So I can let my lazy DBA brain go on, is to say, okay, make sure that this gets set up properly so I don't have to worry about it later. We're going to set up some service accounts, and just by, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to use the same account for the engine and the agent. We're going to set those directories that I created in the OS part. We're going to set those as our default database directories, and then finally just set the agent to auto start. Then finally, the availability group. So I'm just going to set up, I've got a failover cluster that I'm going to create across the two SQL Server servers. Set up a file share witness for quorum, because, well, you need quorum. And then when they create the availability group, it's going to be just 2 nodes, synchronous commit, automatic failover, and then we're going to push AdventureWorks 2014 into it. And that's pretty much it. Like I said, this is what we're going to get to. This is our kind of our checklist. And now that we know what we're trying to get to, now we would sketch out the steps and actually build our script around it. So other than that, the rest of this is going to be demo, guys. So we're going to get heavy into scripts and show you a lot of stuff here. Are there any questions before we go into that?
There is. Is the OS build part of your automation?
Yes, yes. Like I said, I'm going to talk to it as I go through the scripts, but I'm not actually going to do it because I don't want you guys sitting around for like 5-10 minutes while we watch a VM get spun up. Yeah, it is all part of the automation. Any other questions out there, Wolf?
Not at this moment.
All right, and so it begins. We are looking at, so as you can see, I've got a bunch of scripts open here, and we're going to probably walk through most of these. And this is literally for me setting up my virtual machine lab from scratch, from absolutely nothing. So a couple of these scripts are actually used to deploy a domain controller and set up a DHCP scope. Things that you probably normally don't want to mess with, and normally, and honestly, like most of my headaches come around setting up DHCP and IP addresses and networking. I'm really glad I never became a network administrator, because this stuff just makes me want to shoot myself in the head. But I'm going to start with this first script here, because this sets up a few things for me. Now, there's a couple different things, ways that I drive this. First off, I have a custom module that has some specialized functions that I use, and they're mostly just wrappers for things like new VM out of Hyper-V, or if I were doing VMware. And that's something, let me just talk as an aside here. I'm doing this all using Hyper-V on my my laptop. You can do all this with VMware. It'd just be different commandlets that you would use using PowerCLI as opposed to the Hyper-V commandlets. I'm not entirely sure about how you would do this with what's the Oracle VirtualBox. I'm not sure necessarily how you would do this with VirtualBox. I know it has some command line options, but there's no PowerShell commandlets for it. I like Hyper-V just because it comes as part of Windows 10, so it's easy for me. But I have this custom module that wraps some functionality around for me, and then I drive a lot of stuff, try to use as many configuration files as I can. So I have this labvm.json. I use a JSON file that basically defines stuff like the working directory that I'm going to put work files into, my virtual machine or my virtual lab virtual switches that I'm going to create. And then I can create a set of servers. So I've got my domain here, which is the Empire domain. Yes, the PowerShell is all about the dark side, folks. Welcome to the dark side. We have cookies and milk. But then I can declare, like I'm declaring basically a set of config files or a set of config settings for my server. So a name, a type. So I in my templates, and I'll talk a little bit about templates here in a moment, I have two types of servers. I have full Windows deployed servers, and then I have server core servers. When I deploy SQL, I try to do it on server core. I don't want to have all the overhead, particularly for a local VM lab, of all the GUI and everything. I could easily change my config to change from core to full, and then when I rebuild my lab, it'll do that appropriately. But I prefer, this is how I kind of organize things. And then, so that's what I'm going to do is load up this lab config into an object within PowerShell, and I can reference them things like the working directory. And I do a little check to see if it exists or not. And then I create my network switches. This is all kind of my initial, I run this once just to get some initialization things going on. Now, the other thing that I need to do when I build a lab out is I need to know some credentials, right? I need to know local admin, a domain admin credential, and a SQL Server credential. The way I manage this is there's a get credential commandlet that allows me to actually create a credential object, but then I write that out to an encrypted XML file. This is just a file that I can now reference with all the other scripts, so I don't have to keep re-entering this credential, and it stores it in somewhat of a secure fashion, right? Because it's actually an encrypted file. If I go here and do a file, let me do a file open. Let's see, just so you guys can see what this looks like. XML. So if I open up like the local admin, you'll see that it actually stores my credential information, but the password is an encrypted password. It's not human readable. So this is a way that I can basically store my credentials and reuse them for these scripts and have them in a secure manner. So basically the first part of my setup is to just get all this base configuration built. The second script that I have here, let me actually go here since we're not running anything. This is actually where I build my initial VMs for my lab. And so if you're doing this either in a lab or in your environment, you just have something that says, okay, create me a base VM. And this is where I use some of my custom functionality. Again, don't focus too much on all the code that I'm throwing at you, but basically I'm going to go through I'm going to figure out what servers I need to build, and I have a thing here where I can run this and basically only rebuild my SQL servers or rebuild the entire lab. But then what I'll do is I'll import the local administrator credential, and then I use my custom function that is a wrapper for new VM, and I basically create a new lab VM that has the server name. I stick here's where the VM is going to go, the virtual hard disk is going to go. I do attach the server ISO and the SQL ISO so that I can reference these for other steps in the process. And then I'm using a base image. So one of the things that you should always think about when you're building out an automated process is where can you use templates? Where can you create some sort of base image that you're going to build stuff off of? And for me, I build a base OS image. I'll insert customized PowerShell modules and do set up my local administrator. I'll do all that base OS configuration. And then from that point, I clone the template and use that to build everything else off of. So what I'm doing here is I'm basically creating a new VM based off of a template that I've already created and then doing some other settings with it. Once I do that, I have to do a few things that are cleanup. So I'm going to go ahead and enable the VM integration service, which is just some additional Hyper-V configuration stuff. And then I'm going to load some modules from the PowerShell gallery so that will enable both my build and ongoing management. So things like computer management, Active Directory, DHCP server, SQL Server. I will automatically build those or load those into the machine I just built. And then what I do is this is a little bit of a gotcha. So one of the things that I hate about server core is it defaults to the command shell, not PowerShell. So this line here, I'm basically just going through and setting my default shell to be PowerShell. And then I also renamed the computer because it's got that generic win dash blah 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 blah. I want it to be the VM name. So then I'm going to rename the computer. And then if it's a full machine, that's when I go down here and I just rename the computer and restart it. So script number 1 here is basically going to create the new VMs from a template, and then get all the settings in it that allow me to then continue on. The next script here, they're actually a little out of order because of the alphabetical stuff. This I'm actually using the DSC to create a domain controller. Without getting too much into detail about what's going on here to create the domain controller, I basically am going to finding the domain controller, loading several files, so copying it from my host down to the virtual machine, and then I call the DSC script. Now, what does DSC look like? Let's jump over to this vmdsc.ps1. So really, it's kind of a custom function. You're going to have this configuration here, and we're going to give it a name, and then within the configuration, we have to declare a few things. First off, there's a param block that just basically, here's the computer name that we're going to apply this to, some specialized variables that we're going to pass down here, and then now we get down to the resources that we're going to apply. So first off, I'm going to load up custom resources. Now, I don't have these custom resources on my host machine. That's why we're seeing this little error, but I always make sure they get deployed down to the machine I'm building. I'm going to load up the password, and then what we go through here is, and we're going to, this is basically how you define your resources in DSC. So I want to specify a specific IP address for my domain controller. So I'm saying, okay, set the IP to 10.10.10.1. And then I'm going to start adding a bunch of Windows features. So Active Directory features, DHCP features, the remote administration tools for Active Directory, for DHCP, for DNS. And really the configuration you'll see here is pretty simple. It's just saying, hey, ensure that the tool is present. Here's what the name of the tool is. And then if I need to, include all sub-features. And what PowerShell is going to do when I run this is going to check and say, does that feature exist? And if it does, it's going to ignore it. If it doesn't, it's going to go ahead and install it. But then I go through and I apply this. And then I use the Active Directory resource to actually go ahead and run the setup of the domain. And really, so this is a custom function. I will deploy it out there, and then the rest of this stuff down here is essentially the set DSC local configuration manager says, here's the DSC, here's where that configuration is located, and then go ahead and run the DSC. So what this really all does at the end of the day is when I initiate this, it's going to go through the virtual machine and apply all these configurations that I declare up here. That's pretty much it. So this is step 2. It builds the DC. We're not going to worry too much about this. What we really want to talk about is prepping the SQL server. So now, at this point in my lab build, I've created a domain controller, and then I've created, and I've got 2 other generic VMs that are sitting there. So once the domain controller build gets done, and I've created, the other thing here is this, I've got a DSC script that creates the DHCP. So once I've done all that, I've got that all in play now. I now have an environment where I have a domain controller. I have, a subnet that I can, or a network that I can join these machines to. So now I actually want to create my 2 SQL machines. And the first step here is to go through. I set a bunch of variables. This block here will create my SQL service account, and then I create just a generic account for myself because I really shouldn't be using the administrator account, but I'm lazy. And then so what I'll do is I'll have the script block that creates the service account, and then I actually run it here. Then I'll go through and reset the DNS to make sure that these 2 machines now are part of the network that I just created for my domain. I do put a pause in here, and then finally I call DSC now for I've got a script here that I'm calling this SQL DSC, and this will actually go through now and apply DSC to the SQL instances, or the machines I'm going to use for SQL, to where I now say, okay, I want to create a couple file directories, so here are my resources for file directories. I'm going to create a failover cluster, or I'm going to install the failover cluster Windows feature. I'm going to open up my firewall ports, so I'm using resources for the firewall, and I basically just apply this configuration. And then once I get that done, I'm going to have my 2 SQL instances basically ready for SQL to be installed. And so now if I go out here and look, I'm just going to pull up this is my Hyper-V manager. So you got my machines, right? I've got my domain controller of Palpatine, and I've got Tarkin and Vader, who are my 2 soon-to-be SQL servers. In fact, if I go out now to my domain controller, which I just got the SQL Management Studio installed to, I can actually open up Server Manager, and as we can go into the domain and actually see that these machines are there waiting for us. Active Directory users and computers. And while that's loading this up, I mean, it is my poor little laptop. So, oh yeah, here we go. So domain, computers, and there you go. You can see that I've got these 2 machines ready to go, but I don't have SQL on them quite yet. So now you actually get to see me run some code. Let me switch over here. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off the SQL install, and then while that's running, I'll talk through it. So I'm just going to run, and this is the nerve-wracking part, because while this works plenty of times, you know, I'm hoping the demo gods are kind to me. But I'm going to kick off this script, and it's going to actually start running the SQL build here. We should see some stuff coming up here in just a bit. Any questions so far on this? Oh yeah, I see that somebody out there what should you put for name? SQL Server. Yeah, yeah. The SQL Server PS module is named SQL Server. In fact, I have a couple typos in there where I need to make sure I'm referencing the SQL Server. Okay.
Yeah, there are a few questions coming in.
Yeah. No, let's go ahead and answer those.
So one is, does service account need to be a local admin? And that's from Andre.
No. By default, a lot of people will make their SQL Server service account local admin, but it doesn't necessarily need to be that.
Okay. Let's see here. We have several here. So they keep coming in. Does SQL Server PowerShell module support result with multiple data sets?
I don't believe that it does. I think that's the Invoke SQL CMD. I believe that there's Drew Fergally, I think is how you say his last name. If I mispronounced that, that's no surprise. But I think his blog is port1433.com, and I think he has a great blog post on how Invoke SQL CMD does not do that and ways that you can work around that or other options for that.
Okay. There's a couple questions here saying, are you sharing the script? So in this, we do record these, and this is going to be up on the YouTube channel as soon as possible. Do you have your GitHub link, or do you just go to GitHub and...
I'll share my GitHub link at the end of the presentation.
Okay. There are more questions. So another one is, from which box are you running these scripts?
This is running from my domain controller. So this is not running on either of the SQL servers, sort of. Let me actually talk through that, because now that the script is running, and you guys can see that we're basically seeing the SQL install log. So the way that this is working is when I called that script, this is the script that's running. I set my initial parameters of the script. I import some of these credential files. And then what I'm going to do is ultimately, I'm going to first run this SQL DSC script. And so that goes through and does all those configurations. And you actually, if I have the opportunity here, let's see if I can bring this back. Oh, no, actually, so no, I'm sorry. I'm running this on my host. I forgot about that. I'm running it remotely, and I can't seem to find this. There we go. So if I'm looking at this, and it's flying by, so it's going to be hard for me to actually show this. But if I scroll all the way back up, it's already off the screen. But when I called the DSC, it actually went through and made those configurations in parallel. So this is running from my host, and I'm basically logging into the domain controller initiating the script run from the domain controller. So we call the DSC script, and this is really going to go through and do all those configurations. And then you'll see here, this is where I actually will call setup.exe, and I'm just using an unattended install, right? I'm using that .ini file, and we can actually see the .ini file over here. So I create this ini file, and it's just a SQL ini file where I say quiet is equal to true, indicate progress equal to true, security mode is SQL. I specify, because it's 2016, I can specify my tempdb settings, agent service startup automatic, TCP enabled, and then I have all my default directories. So this is just like you would normally do setup.exe and call a configuration file. And in fact, if I go back here, my script block that I'm setting up is I'm calling e setup.exe. So this is the drive that I've attached the SQL ISO to. I call the configuration file like I normally would, but then obviously I don't want to just be managing my credentials in plain text. So I create the switches for doing my passing my credentials, so the service account name, service account password, and I basically interrogate those credential objects and build out the additional parameter string that I then pass to this. And of course, include the I accept SQL Server terms. And so this is actually running, and then I'll copy these down, and then I invoke that script command. And that's basically just running a SQL Server setup.exe with an unattended file to these boxes. So if I go back, let's look here. It's still running, still going through the process. But yeah, anyway, that's, like I said, that's it. At this point, it's something this is stuff that we've done, for decades. In fact, I think it's getting close to being done. But yeah, so long story short, I created these scripts on the host. I push them out to the domain controller, and then I initiate and run them from the domain controller. All right?
Okay. So let me see. There's a few more questions here. I want to see what we all have answered. We've answered that one. In addition to deployment, do you find this an effective tool for configuration management?
Yes. Yes, I absolutely do. DSC at least. SQL Server is very difficult to do configuration management, mostly because the MSI and the way that the SQL Server install is handled is extremely heavy. They've changed that a little bit for Linux, right, with some of the packages that they've done for the SQL 2017 on Linux, and I can only hope that they bring that same model over to SQL Server on Windows. But that's the DSC stuff is great for configuration management. In fact, it's intended for that. SQL Server, you can sort of do that, but again, I think the limitation there is the MSI and the way that the process is done.
And I believe that was it. I think we're good to put up with our questions.
All right. See, this is the part of the, normally I have this behind some other smoke and mirrors, but we're just waiting for the restore to the install to basically wrap up here.
So there is actually one more question. I'm sorry. And it doesn't even have a name for the asker, so it's odd. Does SQL Server PowerShell? Does SQL Server PowerShell? No. I think we answered that one.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
It's all you.
All right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's at this point, unfortunately, it's a little bit of a song and dance now as we wait for the install to complete. Normally, I try to have this behind like some snapshots of my VMs, but I just didn't have that time. And usually it'll take 5 to 10 minutes to spin this up. And I think this is really the challenge around kind of SQL Server and the deployment, managing these deployments, right, is no matter what we do, we still are going to be kind of, I don't want to say hamstrung, but limited by the processes that Microsoft gives us to actually install the software, right?
Okay, so I do have a few more questions that have come
Yeah,
in.
yeah, go for it.
So first question, can we make it more repeatable if I want to install different SQL versions with different names? I
hmm
mean like every new install.
Well, I mean, yeah. So really, at the end of the day, it's just a matter of what's the setup executable and what's the INI file, because INI file settings change just slightly from version to version. So you could make a wrapper that is, and in fact, in a lot of ways, the scripts I have they're fairly, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not really super aware of the version of SQL. They're just running setup.exe. So you could build this out to say, well, this one I want to be SQL 2012, and this one I want to be SQL 2016. And as long as you've got the right executable combined with the right INI file, yeah, it's not a big deal. It can totally be used, because in a lot of ways the same steps are going to be done, right? Other questions?
Okay, so they're pouring
That's fine.
in. It's hard to read them here. Hold on a second. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Let's see here. There's one about JSON if I can get to it. They keep for
Things
large
fly in so quickly, yeah.
for larger deployments. How are you managing the source configuration data? Are you using the JSON files like you are in your lab?
Yeah, I mean, so ultimately this comes back to my saw of we're all developers now. In a lot of everybody out there, every DBA is an administrator, is in some way a developer. And so when I manage these files and kind of the ultimate, what's constructing it, it's all about what I'm putting into GitHub. And you can use GitHub, you can use SVC, you can use SVM, I forget. You can use Team Foundation Services, whatever you want to use. It's just a matter of having that source control. So where if I go into GitHub, and I'll bring this over here in just a moment, and again, this link will be out here at the end. But if I go into my PowerShell repo, and then I go into, I've got this all under MSVM, like all these files are going to be stored in here. In fact, when I update this, it's going to actually, I got to push the code up that I've been tweaking here. But this is going to have a history behind it, right? And I'm going to manage the configuration of this through source control. So if people are changing my config files or adding stuff, however I want to modify that, it will be tracked in source control. You, of course, can make this as flexible or, as agnostic about stuff as you want, but ultimately, at the end of the day, I just treat all this code as source-controlled code and manage it that way.
Okay. So can configuration management of SQL on Windows be done as post-installation to reduce the complexity?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, there's.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No,
Another
no.
one, and some of these I could answer as well, but what about patching SQL Server and OS? Can that be used PowerShell as well?
Yeah, absolutely. PowerShell could do many of those things. And the patching becomes very interesting, right? Because it just becomes one of these like, okay, I got to keep, know when to run these. And there's a lot of tools out there for managing PowerShell, WSUS. Okay, yay, it's all done. So, there's tools out there. PowerShell can initiate all that stuff. In fact, there's a great I think it's called PS Windows Update that you can get a hold of out of the gallery. While I'm answering this, so the next, just to keep us on time, because we've got about 10 minutes left, I want to go ahead and kick off my availability group build. So I've got the SQL servers now, right? In fact, if I go here and open up SQL, come on, management. Oh, you're going to be this way, aren't you? Microsoft SQL Server Tools, Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to load that up, and we'll take a look at it here, but I want to go ahead and kick this script off. So now we're going to do 5 deploy AG. And then I'll walk through this. But yeah, you can totally use PowerShell to do that. Now, the way that the availability group stuff works is I've got, oh, and I didn't actually open it up. Let me open up that file. See, get PowerShell. Yeah, so for deploying the AG, there's a couple specific, oh, I opened up the wrong thing. I wanted to open up build AG. So the way that the PowerShell works, right? So, or the availability group works is the first thing you want to do is build a cluster. And the nice thing about Windows clustering is it's simply new cluster, declare the nodes that are going to be in it, the static IP address, and then I'm going to set a cluster quorum with the file share witness. Once I've done that, then I can use the power. These are all like in the SQL Server module, where I'm going to first enable SQL always on. I'm going to grant some permissions to each one. So I have to have the service accounts need to have these permissions, alter availability group, connect SQL, view server state, login, and connect. And then what I'm going to do is take this SQL and loop through each node in my availability group cluster, enable the endpoint for the availability group, start the endpoint. I need to create a collection of replicas using the new SQL availability group replica. And then I'm basically running this SQL against each node. So this gets each node kind of prepped to be part of the availability group. And then really it's build availability group, new SQL availability group with a name, using a path. So this is using the SQL provider path. There's parts of me that want the Microsoft to update these commandlets to be a little cleaner. But really, at the end of the day, I'm going to create the availability group with this replica collection that I built up here. And then I join each node to the availability group. I also will create a listener. I am being a little lazy and just using DHCP for the listener, but this builds the availability group. And then this step down here, I'm just going through, I'm restoring AdventureWorks in no recovery mode to each node. And then I'll fully recover it on the primary node and all the secondary nodes I join, right? So it's all kind of processes that we're using, but you'll see that it's all scripted out. It's all in PowerShell. So I can run this over and over and over again. And then if I go back to here, not go back to here. If I go back to here, we're in the process. So, I created my quorum witness. I created some stuff on it. I've created the cluster, and it's basically doing a little bit of a pause here before it actually goes through and builds the AHE to make sure all the DNS stuff is there, but we'll let that continue to run. But again, everything's scripted. Everything's kind of going through this automated process. So the cluster got built, and now we're just going to wait for it to actually go through and do all the SQL Server stuff. So I kind of got off track there. I think I lost track of the question. Hopefully I got it answered, but I wanted to make sure we touched on the availability group stuff while this takes the next few minutes to build.
So, okay, there's a couple of questions. One is, and I can't remember the website, so you can maybe help me. Is there a PowerShell cheat sheet for SQL?
Yeah.
I forget what the website is.
There's lots of different resources out there. I always recommend, I have a Microsoft Virtual Academy presentation on some of this stuff that's a little dated. I know Jess Borland has a PowerShell cheat sheet.
Hiram reminded me. Thanks, Hiram.
Yeah.
dbatools.io.
Oh yeah, so dbatools.io is a great it's a community module that builds a lot of functionality out into PowerShell. In fact, some of the stuff that I'm doing today could probably be leveraging the DBA tools for it. I love DBA tools and it's got some good stuff, but usually when I do these kind of presentations, I don't want to make it necessarily dependent on a community tool for that.
Oh, of course, of course.
Yeah, so there we go. An availability group built in 3 minutes and 42 seconds, all via that script.
Sheesh.
Yeah, and now if I go and look here, I'm going to connect. Let's connect to Tarkin, just to kind of see it out. And I know we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to let's put a hold on the questions for now, just for me to kind of get through the rest of this. But yeah, so there's our database. It's synchronized. There's our availability group. And so note, guys, like throughout this entire process, even though I spent a lot of time walking through the script and showing you stuff, I literally ran like 5 lines, right? I called one script, I hit enter. I called another script, I hit enter. I called another script, I hit enter, right? So this is all built. I didn't have to like enter any other information other than what I had initially created. And that's the beauty of this, is at this point now, like I can just fire this over and over and over again. I could tear this down and give me about 45 minutes and I can rebuild the whole thing and be ready to go. So with that, I'm going to jump back over to the slide deck here and just walk through a few other things. Because, I mean, now that you've seen this and kind of how it works, and again, don't focus too much on the code. Hopefully you understood the process enough, but feel free to download it and pick the code apart. But really what this means now is, like, from a physical hardware standpoint, if you're still doing physical servers, you can now script this stuff out, build this all, and you know that you're going to have reliable and consistent builds, things that can get turned around quickly, and things that could get turned around by non-DBAs, right? So now you can hand these build scripts off to system administrators and say, here, deploy a SQL server for somebody, and you don't have to be involved. You now can go and do query tuning or whatever other things are enjoyable for you. And of course, with virtual, we get all that stuff, as well as I think a little more deploy on demand. Like, we don't have to wait for hardware to get provisioned and racked and everything. I start to move into this phase of treating servers as disposable, because now that I have these scripts, let's say something got screwed up with a SQL server, if I can take a backup of that data, now I can just blow the server away, recreate it in a few minutes, and then just restore the data to it. You can start to expand and migrate quickly. You don't have to sit there and go, okay, all those different steps. I mean, for me, this would take like what would normally be an 8-hour task of me configuring and setting up a SQL server, and did it to an hour where I was only sort of paying attention during that hour, right? And this sort of process is consistent whether you're using VMware, Hyper-V, Azure, AWS. As long as it's a Windows operating system, right, all this stuff's going to work under the covers, and it's just a matter of kind of building the stuff around it. This leads us into the whole DevOps conversation, right? The idea that we want to automate, we want to break down barriers. It comes back to that line I said, if we're all developers now, because now my infrastructure becomes codified, right? I have infrastructure as code, where I'm going to start saying, I'm going to build scripts out, I'm going to deploy things, I'm going to run all this automated process to actually do stuff, and I'm going to source control that. All these scripts that I have, they're in GitHub, they're source controlled. I can see how things have changed over time. If there is a bug or a problem or something that I missed, I just put it into the code, and now it becomes part of that history. And you really start to code through automation. So we've kind of flown through that. I appreciate your patience and kind of, following along here with me, but this is really the ideas that we were trying to get to, right? Scripting these builds out for consistency, repeatability, speed through automation. I will go back and say, really the main focus here is making sure things are consistent and repeatable, and then speed is just an after effect. Speed is just something that happens because I'm doing all these other things. This slide deck will be available, so I've got a couple resources here if you want to follow up with more stuff. Windows PowerShell Desired State Configuration Revealed is a great book that really dives into DSC and how you can use it. Plenty of helpful information on PowerShell.org, and then PowerShell In-Depth is another great resource book that will give you a lot of kind of in-depth material around PowerShell. This is my contact information, so if there's any other follow-up questions or things that you wanted to know, you reach out to me in these ways. And this GitHub repo is where I have all my scripts. This stuff is actually under PowerShell MSF VM Lab, and I'm going to be actually pushing some new code to it here shortly based off this presentation today. With that, I appreciate your guys' time. We are at the hour, so I think we're going to need to wrap up here quickly, but let's answer what we can.
I believe there was only one more. One question was, if you rerun the same script, will it remove and reapply everything from scratch?
Item potency, that great 25-cent word of, can I rerun a script and how will it affect things?
Right.
In general, I try to build that into the scripts. Some of that is not quite into these scripts as yet, but that's definitely possible. And it's just a matter of how you script out your process.
Right. And the last one is more of a comment. It's would like to see a session about patching lists of clustered SQL servers. Some best practices would be appreciated. So that's more of a request.
Right. Yeah. I'll definitely see what I can put up, like maybe in the way of a blog post or something. But yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Well, I appreciate it, guys.
So I'm sorry, could you do me one more favor? I know you have to run, Mike. Mike has a meeting he has to go to. Give me a number between 1 and 42.
Well, let's do this the Powershell way, guys. Get random.
There we go.
And the min value is going to be 1, and the max value is going to be 42. 22. Number 22 is our lucky winner.
All right, I will find number 22 on this list. Let's. It'll take me a moment. So if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, no worries.
6, 7, 12.
Nobody leave. 20, 21,
22. Kevin Boolin.
Congratulations.
So, Kevin, if you will email devops@pass.org with your information, I will get you set up for your $100 gift card as given by Redgate. All right? So, Kevin, if you can hear me, send me a message or something in the questions or wherever. But, yep, I see it. Okay, he got it. So, thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you so much, Mr. Mike. I appreciate it. It was wonderful. And guys, I will have this up on YouTube as soon as I can.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys. Have a great rest of your day. And, of course, reach out to me if you have any questions, and I'll make sure this material's made available to you.
All right. Thank you so much. All right.
Catch you all later.
Bye-bye.